Jim Westwood, your president. I'd like to begin the meeting today by introducing a new member who is in the audience. We have other new members, of course, but our new member who is attending today is Betty Cruikshank, salesperson for Remax Associates, Inc. Could you please stand and be welcomed to City Club, Betty? There you are. Welcome to City Club. Next Friday, August 9th, Gundar King, PhD, the Dean of the School of Business Administration at Pacific Lutheran University, will speak on the Baltic states and the trade-offs required to balance political independence with economic interdependence. Dr. King is a native Latvian and has authored several articles on the Baltics and Soviet economic policies. This next Friday, City Club on the Baltics here at the Benson Hotel Mayfair Room. I want to remind you again that June is the month in which the largest percentage of City Club membership renewals become due. So if June is your month to renew and you have not yet done so, please send in your dues. Second notices are going out if you have misplaced your first notice, but if you still have the first one around, send it in and nobody will realize that you had to wait to be jogged a second time. This is a big year for City Club with soon-to-be released ethnic minorities reports and the club's 4-week 75th anniversary celebration coming up in September and October. So please do stay involved. Goodness knows your City Club needs you. Our board host today, seated at the head table, is Ross Simmons, a member of the Board of Governors and an environmental consultant with SRH Associates Incorporated, and he, of course, will have the privilege of asking the first question of our speakers. The second question today from a microphone at the floor will be asked by Gretchen Biener, a member of the Government and Taxation Standing Committee. After that, we'll open up the floor to questions from City Club members. I think there are going to be some interesting comments made today, and I hope that the questions will be equally interesting and challenging for our speakers. If you would rather ask a question in writing, you'll notice there are forms on your tables. At the close of our third speaker's presentation, just hold up your form, and a staff member will pick up your question and bring it up to the head table so we can ask that as time allows too. Well, last Friday, Norman Solomon made his case to City Club for bias in the news media, and the two culprits he targeted as responsible for media bias could hardly have been safer ones from his standpoint. Can anyone think of an institution with fewer defenders than big corporations or the Pentagon? Well, yes, now that I think of it, how about the Oregon legislature? Oregonians have just finished their biennial observation of those 90 men and women whom they love to abuse and whose reaction to the electorate seems often to be one of fear more than of willingness to lead and educate public opinion. But hold on a moment again. Wasn't it this legislature that enacted an education reform package that has the whole nation's attention for its boldness and innovation? Yeah, probably it is. Well, yes, but it was also this legislature that did nothing, essentially zero, to initiate tax reform in the wake of ballot measure 5. What grade does the legislature deserve then? City Club has invited 3 journalists to answer that question today. We'll be hearing first from Jeff Mapes, who has just finished covering his 4th legislative session as a political reporter for the Oregonian. Jeff has covered national political campaigns and local ones as well, and he spent 4 years as a Washington correspondent for the Scripps League newspapers. Listeners to Oregon Public Broadcasting will recognize the voice of our second speaker, Bill Lunch. Bill has broadcast daily radio messages during the 1991 session, and he remains a radio political analyst while on leave from his associate professor's position in the political science department at Oregon State University. Gail Kinsey Hill, our third speaker, is a Portland native. She began her journalistic career with the Bend Bulletin, where I'm told she was able to combine journalism and skiing. She was an associate editor and reporter for Oregon Business Magazine and later served as the editor of the Business Journal. Since 1990, she's been a political reporter for the Oregonian, and in the 1991 session, she covered principally environmental issues. Together, our panel today will give, I hope, a candid, unabashed, unbiased report card on the 1991 legislative session. And here to begin that job is Oregonian correspondent Jeff Mapes.
Thanks. I guess I'm rather pleased that you'd want to listen to us after hearing from Norman Solomon last week, that we're lackeys of the establishment and everything. I thought it was rather ironic that the same day he delivered his critique here, the Oregon Citizens Alliance announced a boycott of the Oregonian for kind of the opposite reasons. I was thinking maybe we could have a new slogan for the Oregonian: easy on nuclear power and hard on the nuclear family, something like that. But at any rate, I do thank you for inviting me. And in fact, I want to start with a caveat that I haven't returned from a year in the Persian Gulf or anything, but boy, there's kind of a simple pleasure to walking down the streets of Portland on a nice day, to interesting people watching, good restaurants, a spark of accomplishment in the air. These aren't, any small things after 6 months of being stationed in the basement of the state capitol during a session of the legislature. I mean, not that there's anything wrong with Salem as long as you miss the 5:01 rush minute when the state workers get off, or you like the tuna melts in the Capitol coffee shop, or in my case, if you like an hour on I-5 to unwind after work. But I guess this speech isn't going to work for the Salem City Club, man. At any rate, you didn't really hear us, or didn't come here to hear us bash Salem. As Jim said, we're here to knock around the Oregon legislature a little bit. But to be honest, I mean, I like to knock people as much as anyone, I guess, but I'm a little bit of two minds about what to say. They do make a pretty inviting target, but I think they also exceeded the very modest expectations I had for them this year. And let me explain that a little bit more. Our editorial board gave the legislature an F for failing to come to grips with Measure 5. As you all know, they didn't come up with a plan for how the state, schools, and local governments are going to provide their current services once the property tax limit is fully phased in. There's no question that they didn't show any particular leadership in getting us beyond this next 2-year cycle. I have to say, though, in fairness, I don't think a wait until later approach is necessarily doomed to failure. I think we're going to know a lot more about what kind of property tax revenues we'll have. One thing that's been very hard about getting a handle on this is as soon as they come out with some sort of estimate on the impact of Measure 5, then the assessor comes out with new figures showing that property values are going up higher than they expected, so that means all those estimates are knocked on a kilter, and everybody says, see, this isn't the thing we wanted. So it might help a little bit to live with the system a little longer. And also at the same time, we have government, the governor now has a task force that's looking into government efficiency. Maybe that'll come up with some ideas. So they may be right when they say the climate will be better in a year or so to deal with this problem. Although I don't think the legislature helped itself by stifling any attempts to at least draft some tax proposals, have some things out there for people to consider and inform the debate a little bit more. And I think they would have had a lot more credibility if the legislators, governors, other statewide officials had gotten together at the start of the session and agreed on a timetable for action. There was a lot of flopping around at the beginning that I think hurt their credibility. And I guess I don't know a nicer way to put this, but there's still a little bit of a sense of touchy-feely to how this governor's conversation is going to go with the public. You know, is it just going to be basically PR and cover for getting this plan or what? As I said earlier, I didn't have particularly high expectations for the legislature. To start out with, you had a governor elected with a minority of the vote whose platform, which basically consisted of several spending proposals, became largely moot the moment Measure 5 passed. So I don't really think she came to the legislature with a mandate. In addition, for the first time in 20 years, there was a split in legislative control with a Republican House and a Democratic Senate, and that's certainly been a formula for deadlock in Congress and in some other states. And in fact, up until a month before the end of the session, almost nothing of significance was assured of making it through the legislature. But the two houses did figure out how to negotiate with each other. Several of the conference committees, there was a much larger stress on conference committees this time than we've seen in several years. Several of them actually worked, and they came away with some accomplishments that you've no doubt heard him bragging about. These included such things on social issues as an extension of family leave policies and new restrictions on minors' access to tobacco. Gail will discuss several environmental bills and and Bill, I understand, is going to talk about educational reform. The legislature also came up with the money to try out Senate President John Kitzhaber's health care rationing plan. That's the one that ranks medical procedures and tries to deliver the top priorities to the entire population below the poverty level, as well as a health insurance reform bill that might, well, possibly, maybe, sort of, for any of those dealing with health insurance. The idea is to end the skimming that's going on in the small business health insurance market. And I think a couple of factors came into play in producing these successes. One is, I think to an extent, we still have a results-oriented legislature. They only meet once every other year, and it really does leave a bad taste in everybody's mouth if they go away empty-handed. This is not like a legislative body that, oh, well, they're going to be back in 2 or 3 months, so it's easy to pass things on. And the more I think about it, in fact, that might actually be a good argument for continuing the biennial session of the legislature. In fact, if I'm not incorrect, I think the City Club has endorsed annual sessions in the past, but there's something to be said for having the legislature as a very distinctive event that doesn't occur that often and puts a little bit more of a spotlight on them. Secondly, and this is kind of a funny thing that happened with the party split and control, legislators from one house felt no compunction about accusing the other house of killing a bill because it was no longer a leader from their own party doing it. And I think the Senate Democrats were particularly adept at this. For example, they accused the Republicans of getting in bed with the tobacco industry, of being insensitive to the environment, that sort of thing. And I think that helped keep the blowtorch under House Speaker Larry Campbell to come out with something on those issues. And Republicans, because they were in power for the first time, were, I think, still learning the ropes. Still, one Republican legislator reminded me of the old movie The Candidate, where Robert Redford gets elected and then turns to his guy and says, now what? So the Republicans had a sense of that, and they wound up in the session almost playing more of a gatekeeper role, that there was a flood of initiatives coming over from the Senate, and they kind of decided which ones they were going to take, what form, how much they were going to narrow them down. And they tended to do this more than to come up with their own initiatives. One of the big things that Campbell did focus on was a government efficiency committee that once they sort of got into it, they thought, boy, this is a big job, and wound up coming up with fairly minor legislation about having state employees turn over their frequent flyer miles to the state and that sort of thing. And even that, however, wound up dying in a Senate committee. So they didn't get real far on that one. But I think, though, it's worth talking some about this split, because I think it could be with us for a long time in the future. If the Republicans keep control of the House in the next election after reapportionment, I think they'll be hard to dislodge for the rest of the decade. And meanwhile, the Senate seems to just be getting unshakably Democratic. It's 19 to 11 at this point, and the redistricting plan may actually benefit the Democrats to a seat or two. So I think this is something we're going to have to get used to. And I think at its best, a divided legislature can do good work on health care, educational reform, and other issues, that cross party lines that are of broad general concern. But we certainly I don't feel like we have a good idea yet of how a divided legislature would work on an issue that really could make or break political careers if it really gets down to crunch time on Measure 5 and having to make very, very difficult budget cuts. I don't know how a divided legislature is going to do. I think we're also going to have to wait and see to evaluate Governor Roberts. Well, I'm starting to sound like an editorialist here, aren't I? Wait and see. This is great. I don't think she got anything particularly impressive out of the legislature this year, but then she didn't really ask for a great deal. In fact, it was funny during the session. Her chief aide, Patricia McCabe, kept talking about the comparison between May of 1991 and May of 90 when Roberts was running for governor, when she essentially said, look, nobody was really paying attention, and it wasn't crucial for us to be getting out and making a big public splash, which she wasn't. You normally think of May of 91, this is when the legislature's getting down to crunch time, but to them, this was not at all the ball game. They're much more focused on what they can get out of, or on whether they can get tax reform and tax restructuring, because I think she realizes much more that that's how she's going to be judged on than what she's going to be able to get out of this legislature. Finally, I guess I've saved the best for last, the budget. That's the one that always gets people excited. And I think obviously the first thing the governor and legislators will tell you is what a great job they did balancing the budget while still meeting the mandate of Measure 5 to turn over about an extra $625 million over to schools over the next 2 years. You know, we work on a 2-year basis budget, so you have to always keep that in mind. And the governor did have a difficult job of coming up with a budget that made, if I'm remembering correctly, about $400 million in cuts to balance at the start of the year, because when she came into office, she was essentially presented with a budget that you could continue all new program or all current programs, and there wasn't a lot for new programs. Then she had to cut to fill the $625 million that Measure 5 would lose. The problem is, though, when you look at the final budget figures, they don't look like anything impressively tight-fisted. The new general fund budget is about $5.6 billion compared to $4.5 billion for the last 2-year budget cycle. That's a pretty good size increase and has all the folks at Oregon Tax Research excited and stuff, and it's easy to criticize that. Their job was made a lot easier because during this session they got around an extra $200 million a year in higher revenue forecasts, which reduced the size of the cuts they had to make by about a third. And I don't know, I found it pretty ironic that in the face of a national recession, Oregon has had steadily rising tax revenue forecasts over the last 6 months. I bet none of you have ever seen that before during a national downturn. The truth really is that Oregon is probably in better shape now to tackle Measure 5 and all the other issues we're talking about than it ever has been. Fortunately, I think I'd still be eating tuna melts in the Capitol coffee shop if we had the kind of budget situation that California or Connecticut has. So, thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Our next speaker has a voice that I recall hearing through a sleepy haze at 6:30 in the morning as I woke up and listened to the OPB morning report. But I think now that we're all wide awake, we can actually concentrate on what he has to say. And I'm waiting at long last to hear really what Bill Lunch has to say to us. So, Bill, come on in.
Well, at least I woke Jim up. Some people, I guess it was sort of the non-drug alternative to Sominex. But in any event, while talking here today, I sort of thought about what kind of analogy I might draw, since I've been accused of doing that on occasion. And I thought I probably a little bit like a reporter describing the first voyage, and as it turned out the last, of the Titanic, and saying, well, other than the little brush with the iceberg, it was a pretty nice trip. The problem in assessing and giving a grade to this legislature, as Jeff has already indicated, is that you have a number of things accomplished which are not small, but on the other hand, you have one big thing which was not accomplished, and the dealing with Measure 5 is still very much a very large subject to be dealt with in the future. I'm not going to talk about those things, however. Instead, I've got a set of topics that I'm going to try and run through here. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about educational finance and the distribution formula, known to listeners of OPB as the creature, because the politics were so tough. Secondly, we'll talk about the CATS bill a little bit and the educational restructuring, which the governor signed yesterday. Third, very briefly, higher education. And fourth, your favorite topic if you're a political junkie, reapportionment. So the distribution formula. It helps to remember that before Measure 5, we had a locally based educational finance system in Oregon. About 70% of the money for schools came from local sources, primarily property taxes. With the passage of Measure 5, if we now jump forward 5 years to 1996, we will have a system that is very heavily centralized. And at that point in 1996, the estimates are that 75 to 80% of the money for funding K through 12 schools is going to come from the center, from Salem. And so what we're doing here is we're shifting very substantially from a local base in funding to a state base or a centralized system. That means that control is going to shift to Salem, and of course that's tied into the CATS plan in a certain sense. Anyhow, as you move from a local kind of system with great disparities, we had school districts in the state of Oregon that were spending 4 times as much as others because they had the revenue to do that, either because they taxed themselves more heavily or because they had more to tax. You folks here in Portland have one of those school districts that was able to spend more money. People out in rural Oregon, in one of my favorite counties, Crook County, out in Prineville, had a lot less to tax and a lot less that they could spend on schools. Those kinds of disparities, 3 or 4 to 1 disparities in school spending, are going to go away. We're going to get equalization, and we began to see how that was going to happen in the 1991 session. There's 2 academic years in this biennium that we're facing. In the first of them, the legislature agreed fairly early on that academic 91-92, which will start in a month or so, basically the legislature would simply refill the coffers on the basis of the old property tax-based kind of system. There was relatively little effort at equalization for 91-92. But for 92-93, the equalization began to kick in, and a variety of formulas circulated. This was according to the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate, Larry Campbell and John Kitzhaber, the politically most difficult thing they had to do was to deal with school equalization. And 92-93, what happened was a formula was devised, passed the Senate, that would have given the poor districts that had were at the bottom of that scale I described earlier, up to 25% more money in state aid than they had had previously. Rich districts, like the one here in Portland or in Eugene, Corvallis, where I live, those kind of districts would have lost up to 5% in state aid. When the rich districts that were better off if you don't like rich districts, found out about this, they came to Salem howling at the top of their lungs. And between the Senate and the House, the formula was revised. So the relatively better off districts in the end ended up being, as the saying goes, held harmless. That doesn't mean they will get less money. They'll just be even with what they had in 91-92 in the 92-93 school year. The poor districts will get almost 25% increase in state aid. For future years, you can expect to see greater equalization. So districts like the Crook County district that I was talking about a moment ago, or Josephine County, are going to do better. Districts like Eugene and Corvallis and Portland are going to do worse. How about educational structure? You've heard a great deal, and yesterday the governor signed the Katz bill, which grows out of a National Commission report headed by a guy named Ira Magaziner, who came to the legislature and described why we needed to restructure education in the United States. There are a number of changes. Let me run through a few of them, and then I'll focus on the one that probably reveals the most innovative, controversial aspect. Among the elements that are included in this bill are complete availability of Head Start for children who need it. Head Start has proven to be one of those programs that's been very successful. It was started up, as you may remember, back years and years ago. Some of you with long memories may recall the War on Poverty. Remember the War on Poverty? Poverty won. But anyhow, there were some programs out of that period that worked, and one of them was Head Start. It's been shown in research on this to do very well for the youngsters who go through it. So that will be more available as this thing phases in over years. We'll have ungraded kindergarten through 3rd grade to allow kids to go more at their own speed. You'll extend the academic year over a period of phases coming along. We've currently got 175 days in our academic year. That'll go to 220 days by the time this is all over and done with, which is a number of years out. That's big bucks, by the way. I sat down and sort of penciled out, and I don't vouch for these figures in any precise way, but I said to myself at the time when this passed, how much would it cost in terms of extra teacher time? You got to pay teachers if they're going to be teaching all those extra days. How much more would it cost if we did it in the upcoming biennium, 91-93? The answer was $1 billion on top of what is currently being spent. That particular change alone. So the Katz bill, although it didn't include the money in it for this time, has fiscal implications which are quite profound. There'll be regular testing of students in 3rd grade, 5th grade, 8th grade, and 10th grade. And at 10th grade, kids in what is now high school will make a decision. They will either opt for a kind of vocational track, or they will go into a sort of academic college preparation track. And it's that last point that has been the focus of most of the attention, because the Katz Plan and the Magaziner report behind it really are based upon, in many ways, European system of education. Those kinds of systems in Europe are much more class conscious. There's an acceptance that there's going to be a working class and a middle class, and there's going to be differences, and the educational system will reflect those. Well, Americans haven't been willing to do that. This bill represents, therefore, in that regard, at least in symbolic terms, a substantial change from what we have done before. And it's not at all clear to me that when push comes to shove, when we get to these changes actually being implemented later on in the decade of the 90s, that Oregonians are actually going to go for it, not to mention the cost. That is to say that there are substantial costs associated with this bill. Certainly if the Measure 5 problem isn't solved by the time that this bill would be fully implemented, then many of the costly items that are included within it won't happen. Higher education. If K through 12 education was restructured through the Katz bill, higher education was to be restructured through budget cuts. Initially, the governor's budget proposed $85 million in budget cuts for higher ed. After the May revenue forecast, which brought in some bucks that were needed to restore some things, fortunately, $53 million was, as the saying went in official Salem, added back to higher education. And so the cuts weren't as deep. Some folks I know in higher ed said, well, initially we were told they were going to just amputate our right arm, but then later on we learned they would only chop off our right hand, and we were supposed to be happy about that. But in any event, the hidden story, however, about higher ed that has not received a lot of attention, and it's very interesting, is that the higher ed officials in Oregon have essentially decided to play chicken with Measure 5. A bill by Carl Hostica, a representative from Eugene, passed that will allow the state system of higher education to avoid having to give notice to hundreds, perhaps thousands of faculty and staff in June of 1992. Because the state system has a rule that they give a year's notice to faculty and to many staff, researchers, scientists, people like that, confronted with the size of the budget cuts that will come along in 1993, the state system was afraid they were going to have to give notice to lots and lots and lots of people less than a year from now. The Hostica bill will free them from the necessity of doing that, and may, if the 93 legislature goes along, even free them from the necessity of giving notice in June of 1993. But when you get to June of 1994, if there's no replacement revenue, you're going to go off a cliff. So I have described this as the Evel Knievel theory of budgeting. Either you look like a genius as you sail through the air and come down safely on the other side, or you end up in the hospital for a long time. Well, we'll see how that goes. Reapportionment. Reapportionment is the favorite topic of true political junkies, and I'm sure there are some in the audience. Those of you who hang on every bit of news about this will be interested to know that the Republicans did file suit this morning to challenge the congressional map, or lack of congressional map, the legislature having failed to come up with a map. Phil Kiesling, on July 1st, following the state constitutional requirements, got control of redrawing the state legislative maps. He has until August 15th to complete his review and revision of the proposal that he has made. That then goes automatically to the state Supreme Court for review, and depending on how the challenges go, the state Supreme Court has until December 15th to finish its review and deliver a map, and then we go to court all over again. So on that note, I will close, and I'll answer Jim's question for myself at least, having done this, I suppose, many times, giving a grade, that is to say, I think the grade for the 1991 legislature has to be incomplete, but the work that they did was pretty good. So we wait and see.
Thanks, Bill. You have a real knack for making these things come to life, and in the mouth of anyone else, I think it would be dry as dust, but it's fascinating. Thank you for those insights. Our final speaker on mainly the topic of the environment as the legislature dealt with it, Gail Kinsey Hill, comes to us from Portland originally, Central Oregon along the way, and I think that we're beginning to realize that environment has to do a lot more with how you and I make our living as well. So it's an important topic, and Gail, have at it.
I'll try to talk fast, though, so you have some time to grill us a little bit. It's been a month since the session ended, and it suddenly seems so quiet after so much furor. It seemed to end in a blaze of video lights. It almost seems as if in the flash people forgot what had come before. But a lot did come before, and a lot of these things are destined, despite what the Britons of the world might say, to have a much greater effect on our lives. Environmental legislation stands among them. For all the talk that nothing much was going to happen, quite a bit actually did. I wouldn't say that the earth moved, but it certainly shook a bit. One of the major environmental bills to make it through the process was recycling. The measure sets goals and standards for recycling waste. It sets minimum content requirements for newsprint, for glass, and even for plastic. It requires a study of waste so that we know where our garbage comes from and where it goes. The goals, which vary from county to county, aren't necessarily a stretch. Metro, for example, already has just about reached its 1995 goal, but it's a start. And for those that were looking for accomplishment here, I think they see that they're on the way to an enlightened garbage consciousness. Then there was the field burning bill. It sets a schedule to reduce the amount of acreage burned in the Willamette Valley. This is something that the legislature hasn't acted so boldly on in 20 years. It appears ambitious, and it's not unrealistic. In the first few years, you probably won't see much of a difference at all. But by 1998, it reduces acreage from 165,000 acres to 40 to 65,000. The key here, of course, is developing an alternative, and there's money in this bill for research and development. But I must admit, I'm a bit of a skeptic. There's a long way to go before they come up with an economically viable alternative. After the bill passed, the grass seed farmers said, well, there's no turning back. But if there's to be no turning back, they have to have something to turn to. There's the Forest Practices Act. Most of the action has been on the national level regarding federal lands, the spotted owl, and harvest levels. But the state's been under pressure, too, on the management of its lands and on private lands. This one went down to the wire. You had the liberal view that you needed strong regulation. You had the conservative view who were holding out for private property rights. But in the middle, they did find a compromise. They ended with a bill that limits clear cuts. It set standards for reforestation and wildlife and river protections. There was a gold mining bill also. It regulates a new process called cyanide heap leach mining. It's not used in this state yet, but there's been interest, and it's been known to have severe environmental effects in other states. So this bill seeks to monitor this process and to set safeguards into place. The governor's been particularly proud of this one because of its preventative approach. Meanwhile, probably the biggest failure was secondary lands. Lawmakers and special interest groups were far apart at the beginning. They remained far apart at the end. They just couldn't come to terms on how to define secondary lands, those lands currently zoned exclusively for farm and forest use, but are marginally productive and probably worthy of new classification and more kinds of development. The Kitzhaber clan said there just wasn't much out there. The Parkinson group said, hey, lighten up a little bit, there's plenty to be had. Here was consensus building at its best and its worst. They began negotiating before the legislature started. They kept trying to reach a compromise, and they kept getting nowhere. But back to the bills that passed. Besides those that I mentioned, there were those that tackled air pollution, leaking underground gasoline storage tanks, and oil spills. So why did so much happen in a political climate that promised so little? I think there was an acknowledgement that something needed to be done, that the public wanted something done. And with the public here, I'm talking not only about their power to vote for a legislature, but their initiative power. I think the initiative or the prospect of one played a significant role at keeping people at the table. Certainly that was true with the recycling in the aftermath of Measure 6, and I think it went for the Forest Practices Act as well, given the industry saw what was going on in California and they didn't want similar efforts to occur here. As for field burning, environmental groups had announced that if legislation failed, they would file an initiative. Another factor, I think, was the different party leaderships in the House and the Senate. It turned out, I think, that the very polarization that threatened to stalemate action actually created a middle ground and room for compromise. The Democrats knew that they couldn't push too far if they wanted something done, and the Republicans knew they'd have to compromise too or look mean-spirited. And when it comes to politics and the environment, even the appearance of doing harm is not the way to go. The final motivating factor may have been the governor herself. She sees herself as an environmental governor, and although she wasn't a strong and visible force during the session, there were some environmental bills that she wanted passed, and she and her staff worked to make sure that they moved in the right direction. In short, I think you had the public's will, you had the legislative dynamic, and you had the governor, maybe kind of a form of harmonic convergence, and then you got those bills.
Thanks, Gail. I think a new political catchphrase has been coined today. Oregon will henceforth be known, among other things, pardon me, for its enlightened garbage consciousness. I think that's a fine term. And I think we've seen all three of our commentators today doing something that I was a little surprised to see. They're actually praising the legislature with faint damnation. It's, well, it's time now for questions, and the first question belongs to Ross Simmons, member of the board and today's board host.
Thanks, Jim. I have a question to address to each of you, and it's kind of a three-parter. Number one, do you see the legislature this session breaking down pretty much along urban versus rural lines, or Portland versus the rest of the state lines? And if the answer to that is yes, as I suspect it is, who won? And then thirdly, what do you see as the prospects for that dynamic over the rest of this decade?
Well, I guess we're going to take an order. I can start. That was one of the very interesting dynamics of the legislature, was the split between the urban and rural sides. It's always been there, but the rural forces had a lot more clout in this session because of the Republicans taking control. I don't have the exact figures, but something like 13 out of the 17 Republican chairs of committees were from rural areas, which was almost an exact reverse flip-flop of the way it had been under Democratic control. And the rural legislators, they came in with a lot of vim and vigor and said, you know, we're not going to take this anymore and we're going to be tough. And interestingly, though, the main thing, at least the Portland urban legislators wanted, was light rail. Probably the main thing the rural legislators wanted was more money for their schools, because they tend to have the school districts that have the lower funding. And in the end, I think both won. I mean, I think legislators realized there was just no way they could let light rail fail. I mean, we're talking about a $1 billion program, you know, that brings an incredible amount of federal money into the state. Nobody could afford to see that as a failure. But on the other hand, the rural legislators were able to use that as for some leverage. They got some things out of the lottery program and some economic development programs they might not have been able to get. And it may have had an impact, too, on how they were able to get money for schools. I'd maybe ask Bill to tackle that part of it a little more, because I didn't cover the fight over the school distribution formula. But in a lot of people's mind, it was certainly linked.
Do you want me to go next?
Yeah, why don't you
Okay.
respond to that
All
one
right.
part of it?
By preface, I would say one of the trends I've seen, not just in this legislature, but in the last year and a half, 2 years, has been an increasing tendency for Oregon politics to be divided sort of Portland downstate. That's moderated to some extent by the influence of the Willamette Valley. But certainly Jeff is absolutely right that there was a very strong urban-rural split in this legislature. I think the rural areas, to answer the question he put last, did pretty well on the school distribution formula for 92, 93. Most of the poor districts, not all of them, as I was reminded forcefully by some people who came from some urban districts that weren't so well off, but most of the poor districts, so-called, tend to be rural in their characteristics. And most of the districts that are going to, in the long run, lose as a result of the increasing centralization and equalization of school finance are urban in character. On balance, though, my assessment of who won is that I think most of the time it was the urban folks who prevailed. The list of environmental achievements that Gail ran through is mainly a list of policies sought by urban people, whether they lived in Portland or Eugene or some other place. As for the prospects, I don't know that we're headed for the kind of situation you have in Illinois, in which you've got sort of Chicago versus downstate as the great division in state politics. But it seems to me the trends of the last couple of years are likely to lead us to greater political distinctions between Portland and its environs, Washington, Clackamas County, and the rest of the state.
I don't really have any session to compare it to. This was my first, but you did see that split in just about every committee meeting, in many of the floor debates. Take secondary lands. I think one of the reasons that it failed was because there was such a separation. There were rural interests who were saying, well, why are you telling me I can't use this land? I can't even grow rattlesnakes on it. And they just dug in. Or take wood stoves. There was a Clean Air Act, and there was a suggestion, or actually it got quite a way through the process to put some permit fees for the use of wood stoves or for cordwood. And that got thrown out, I think, in conference committee because, I mean, I guess, and this was new to me, but to charge for cordwood's like taking away their gun racks in the back of the pickup trucks. So I saw it time and time again.
Gretchen Biener from the Government and Taxation Committee. I'd like to get back to the issue of reapportionment. Of course, there was bound to be some problems associated with reapportionment given the split in the legislative houses. But I'm also aware from a number of sources, both Democratic and Republican, that there wasn't much attention paid to various interest groups when they came to talk about their particular proposal for reapportionment, that it was sort of done in a closed-door session. I'd like your perception as to how the system failed.
Okay. I guess that's my baby. Reapportionment is sort of the ultimate insider's political game. The Secretary of State, I think to his credit, has been holding a series of 14 or 15 hearings around the state on reapportionment, and from what I understand, most of the folks who have come to those hearings have been either politicians or people whose jobs in one way or another depend on politicians, and that's characteristic. It's not the kind of issue that excites people. It's extremely difficult to interest even attentive citizens in this question. And so I think the interest group leaders probably did encounter some frustration because quite clearly there was a House Democratic plan, a House Republican plan. There were 4 plans out there that we all heard about, and they were very much crafted by the people in those caucuses, as you say, behind closed doors. That's sort of what one would expect. I think the surprise, in a way, Jeff and I talked about this late in June as the deadline began to loom up very close. And I said to him, if I recall correctly, that I didn't think they were going to be able to come to a resolution in the legislature, and that's indeed what happened. Jeff said to me, if I remember correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, these guys have got to be crazy to give this to Phil Kiesling. And that may be so, but that's what happened. And I think that the rest of this battle is going to be fought out in court. And my own assessment is that, at least with regard to Congress, the legal battles which were initiated in some sense today by the Republican filing in district court here in Portland will be so complicated and drawn out that I think it's very likely, in my judgment, and I may be proven wrong in this prediction as in many others, that we will have the 1992 elections on the basis of the 81 lines because the legal wrangling won't be over with in time. You have to think about filing dates and things like that. If we haven't got a map by March of 92, you've got to run with the old lines, and I think that's very likely. As on the state legislative side, I think because of the way the procedures work and the reviews, it's less likely that that's going to happen.
I'd just add one thing that when you talk about special interest or interest group work on reapportionment, I have to say I didn't really see that occur so much. I didn't attend every single hearing of it, but it seemed to me that it was such an inside game that the only time you saw an interest group get involved was when one of the legislators or members of Congress would drag their supporters up in front of the microphone to explain why a certain redistricting plan was good for that interest group. But it really, I mean, the bottom line agenda there was that guy or person was up there testifying before the committee to protect their member of Congress or whatever who'd called him in and said, testify for me. So I didn't see even anybody outside the political process try so much to have a big influence on that.
Gail, you have any comments on that?
No,
Do we have any other questions from the floor? I noticed we have a couple of legislators in the audience too, so this should be a lively discussion coming up. Well, I have a question I'd like to ask then, all three of our commentators. Based on your observation of the legislature this session, what are the hot topics going to be in the next session in '93?
Well, I think it's not necessarily so much getting to the '93 session. I mean, the first question is how much can they accomplish in the interim? I mean, they are pretty much under the gun to come up with a new tax source, or they're going to have a gigantic drop in the budget in '93, at least unless our property values absolutely go through the roof. If I'm correct on the numbers, is it 1.7? It's 1.7 billion dollars next time, as opposed to 625 million dollars this time, and so you're talking about much more dramatic cuts in government if they can't get the voters to approve some sort of new tax this time. So I think the very interesting sort of thing is to see what sort of plan they come up with and what different directions that takes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. The governor has the plan for the conversation, and given her surprising success in her election campaign in 1990, I think you have to take that seriously. However, the experience of other states is that when you are trying to get a new tax source of the magnitude that we're talking about, you almost have to fail the first time out to find out what it is that the voters really oppose, really won't stand for. Given the calendar that the governor's working on, I think we have to assume we're going into the January '93 legislature with the full 1.7 billion or whatever it turns out, 1.6, 1.8, whatever it turns out to be. That level, that's about a third of the state budget. It's going to be horrendous. It's going to make this session look like a cakewalk, in my judgment. And so when you're wrestling with an 800-pound gorilla, whatever other creatures are scurrying around at your feet may not necessarily be so noticeable.
Gail, will field burning still be around in '93?
Well, it certainly will. I mean, it's going to take a couple years before you notice a difference. And again, even if the phase, nobody's saying the schedule or the phase down is going to work. As I recall in '71, when we were doing some research on it, there was a ban on field burning. Well, we all know that they're still burning away. Secondary lands might come up again too. The whole land use issue, that's now in the hands of LCDC. Well, they've tried before too, and it's extremely contentious and emotional issue because you are dealing with people's property rights, and it seems to be the kind of thing that's going to have to be taken care of legislatively and not through administrative rule. There'll probably be others as well. The underground storage tank might come up again. The clean air, there's going to be more with that. I understand both of those might be facing court challenges. They won't go away.
We have a question from the floor from a longtime City Club member. Would you please identify yourself, sir?
I'm Bob Shoemaker, and of course I'm responding to your invitation, Jim. I didn't think I could do otherwise. We had an issue down there which none of you has addressed yet, which we not so fondly called in our caucus the issue from hell. And it was brought upon us by the U.S. Supreme Court case of Davis versus Michigan, which said that if you don't tax state employees, state income tax, you can't tax federal employees. And the prospect of not taxing retirees is not an acceptable one. On the other hand, we had what amounts to a contract with state employees and employees of local governments, which makes it even more complex and difficult, that part of the deal with them was that they would not have to pay state income tax. And yet here we were in this dilemma. We tried to solve it in 1989. We didn't do a very good job. The voters threw it back in our face, and we had to solve it this time. And I don't know that we did it very well, but I think probably you might have some observations on how we handled that politically in the final outcome of that really difficult issue, which raised a great amount of heat and I don't think a whole lot of light.
Yeah, I covered that, so maybe I can handle that. Maybe just to explain a little bit further for background, the the eventual resolution, for years, as Bob said, our PERS retirees have not been taxed. That's state, local, school retirees have not had to pay state income taxes. The legislature took that exemption away and said henceforth retirees in general get a tax credit, figured on a complicated formula I won't bore you with here, but it essentially amounts to a rather small percentage of their retirement income. And then to sort of sweeten the pot a little bit for the people who are losing their tax exemption, we're going to raise PERS benefits. And given all the court challenges, the concerns about breaking this contract with PERS retirees, or PERS employees even, I guess, maybe there's nothing else they could do. I guess to somebody who's not a lawyer, who's just looking at a public policy question, I'm not sure there's a good reason for ever just exempting people from taxation. It always starting to remind me of, when you were a kid and you played Monopoly, you know how somebody come up with the great ideas, well, I'll give you a Monopoly on that area, I'll trade you if you let me have a free pass and I don't have to pay rent, and you end up with a bunch of kids going around and around, nobody has to pay rent anywhere, and the game never ends. If anything else you've learned from this, don't ever exempt people from taxation. Everybody pays it, except as Ronald Reagan says, it should hurt, and they're learning that, and in fact the legislature just made that mistake again a few years ago by putting on the ballot a measure that exempts Social Security income from taxation forever and ever, and when 20 years down the line, when 1 out of 3 of us is on Social Security or whatever it'll be, we're going to be sorry about that one too. So that'll be its own mess. But I guess what I'm saying from all of that, and maybe this is a bias I shouldn't express, but I don't see the logic for exempting people from taxation. And given that, I think you're going to have problems by any time you try to do sort of an end run by saying, okay, we'll make you start paying taxes again, but we're going to raise your benefits on the other end, and that's going to be one of the basis of, I know, the court challenges to it. But I have to admit, given the legal situation there, you probably felt that was the safest course to go.
Well, I would agree that it's a very difficult issue, and I don't see that the legislature had a lot of room for maneuver. The court challenges are coming. It was the federal retirees who brought the referendum, which appeared as Measure 3, probably the most confusing of the measures out of the 11 that we voted on in 1990. And by the way, if you thought you had fun with the 1990 ballot, wait for 1992, because there'll probably be twice as many initiatives and referenda. It's going to be wild. I suspect we'll have something else on the ballot in 92 on this issue. The issue from Hill isn't going to go away soon.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. As usual, I'm concerned about what happened or didn't happen in public transportation in Salem. And while the West Side Light Rail got some money, what about future light rail lines? What about rail service in the valley? And what about rural bus service, which was cut?
Light rail is not going to Salem, I can guarantee you that. I can't say that I have a lot to add on what happened in public transportation in this session. And the focus was so much on light rail that I don't think any of the transit agencies really asked for anything besides that. There wasn't, I don't think, really any discussion other than that. That was such a big issue in and of itself that sort of began and ended the whole discussion for this session.
But the Highway Trust Fund got 2 more cents in
Right.
91 and 2 more cents in 93. So, and again, only to highways. And that's why I say serious problems in the valley with lack of rail service and rural buses. Greyhound has been pulling out from community after community.
Yeah, well, the idea of taking any money away from the gas tax, I think, is that would be sacrilegious to the legislature. I just don't think that they're in any sort of mood at this point to do this. Particularly, I mean, the concern among rural legislators particularly is for more roads and highways. So I just don't see that in the cards.
The only thing I wanted to add is I think there is increasing pressure to crack that highway fund. And just one way or another, either the legislature or some kind of something on a future ballot, because But it's going to be a tough fight because there are the urban interests that would like to see it cracked and used for more public transportation, but then other people who say, hey, no, we put it there specifically for that purpose and it's going to stay. And there's even that whole idea is behind, and there are people that are fighting any indication that anybody's going to tap that fund. That's a reason a couple of these environmental bills might be in danger. I mentioned before the court challenge possibly of the Clean Air Act and underground storage tanks. It involves, I won't go into the details, but it involves taxes or assessments on gasoline or car registration fees and whether that violates those dedicated monies.
Remember that in the 2-cent gas tax increase, which the House passed over Larry Campbell's objections, was included a referral to the voters of a measure which would allow gas tax monies to be used in part to pay state troopers for the state police that patrol the highways. So there will be a measure on the 92 ballot that will deal with this, and we're beginning to see movement on that issue. But the fact that the House would override the wishes of a very powerful speaker, very determined, on an issue like gas taxes is a measure of, I think, the degree to which this concern about highways extends politically much further than many other issues might.
Time for a final question.
I'm Jeff Tashman, City Club member. There seemed to be an unusual amount of confusion and paralysis on the issue of video poker at the end of the session. What was so hard? What was going on there?
That was a fascinating one. It was almost like a novel, kind of following at what a novel of the legislative process or something like that. Really, what happened there was you had a variety of special interests who wanted the video poker, either because they're a games manufacturer or they're bar and tavern owners and they see this as a new source of revenue. A couple other groups like that, and they sort of made almost a casual alliance. That's not the right word, but it was not solid and firm with people who were looking for some more money in the light of Measure 5, particularly, and this ties into light rail. They wanted to put the money for light rail in the lottery, but a lot of legislators, particularly rural legislators, were not happy about tying up light rail for that purpose, and people were kind of scratching their heads and say, hey, what if we take this video poker money, put it in a capital construction fund for big projects, and that way, we get this light rail obligation paid off very quickly. And that got video poker sort of in the process, and it became the leadership's, without it ever having passed, it kind of became the tacit way to make everything fit. It satisfied people's objections about funding light rail and that sort of thing. And so it had a lot of momentum before they ever actually got to the policy decision of, are we going to allow video poker to go ahead or not? And then became just a very fascinating thing in the Senate, where more and more people started, as one other reporter said, the longer this thing was in the light, the more it kind of stunk. And the more people, more senators looked at it, they frankly just sort of had a revulsion to the thing. It was really a very fascinating thing to watch. There really wasn't anybody lobbying against it or anything like that. They just said, hey, what's going on here? How far are we taking the state into gambling? And it just led to really kind of a wild series of events in the last couple of weeks, where the Senate voted for it one week, turned around the next week and voted against it, and leadership said, hey, we've got all these budget decisions made, we've got to save it, and they went through a series of really extraordinary parliamentary maneuvers to keep the thing alive, and it was good sport.
One aspect that is interesting looking at video poker, and I don't think that game is over, by the way, because there are now petitions circulating to refer that to the voters, another item for your 92 ballot. I know you're going to have a wonderful time. And that is that Oregon has traditionally been identified by people who study these things as one of 3 or 4 most moralistic states in the Union in terms of its public policy choices. And so, for example, the initiative and referendum and recall back at the progressive era, our environmental legislation back in the 60s, the Kitzauer health plan now, all of that can be traced, if you want to kind of state moralism. Wisconsin and Vermont are a couple of other moralistic states. But in this case, what happened was because the train got rolling fairly early, as Jeff has described, and the Trade and Economic Development Committee started parceling out the money before it was really on the table, the video poker developed a momentum which was able to overcome the moralism which you saw in the debates on this on the floor, particularly of the Senate, but also of the House. Mike Burton from this part of the world was one of those who made powerful kind of presentation against it. And that carried the day ultimately in the Senate, but as Jeff said, there were some very slick parliamentary maneuvers to save it right at the end of the session.
The only thing I would add is, I mean, the video lottery is big time stuff. It potentially would bring in a lot of money, and I think even the Lottery Commission people would quietly admit that it's a little bit different from the other kinds of lottery games that are being played. And not only the whole moral question that was brought up, but the whole idea that if we got it, it wouldn't just be that for Oregon it might seem a little abnormal or extraordinary. In the whole national scheme of things, it would be extraordinary. I think there's only 2 other states that have video lottery, and in one of them it's relatively new. So,
Just one thing that real quick, it did produce the very best legislative paragraph in a bill that I've ever read in my life, and that was they added in some money to treat gambling addictions to get some, this was to sweeten it with the opponents, but you have to justify it as economic development, and they justified it as economic development by saying video poker is going to destroy people's lives, it's going to create gambling addictions, and we're going to spend this money to fix it, and that's economic development. It was wonderful.
Well, with that, our thanks to Gail Kinsey Hill, Bill Lynch, and Jeff Mapes for a very entertaining presentation. We're adjourned.